Emancipation Radio.
You're listening to Lyrical Rhapsody with Ginnie. Lyrical Rhapsody. You're listening to Lyrical Rhapsody.
This is Ginnie Love, and I'd like to welcome you to a special conversation on Lyrical Rhapsody. Tonight I have actress, artist, and activist Samaria Graham, who you will remember from the NBC series Providence and Martin Lawrence's Nothing to Lose. My co-host, hello Samaria.
Hello.
Hello. And Samaria and I are excited to jump right in with our special guest tonight. Among the most prominent anti-racist writers and educators in the United States, he's been called one of the most brilliant, articulate, and courageous critics of white privilege in the nation. I welcome to the conversation Tim Wise.
Thank you very much. First, before we get started, I want to personally apologize to Samaria. I know that there has been an attempt to get me on the air for like 3 years, and it has been and I just want to apologize and say how sorry I am. It has been nuts, and it just so happens you all caught me at a good time. I'm off the road for, like about 3 months pretty much, so this worked out perfectly, but I wish we could have made this happen earlier. I'm glad we're making it happen tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, timing's everything, and Tim has, for those who don't know, is author of 6 books, including the highly acclaimed memoir, White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. Also a book entitled Between Barack and a Hard Place, I love that, Racism and White Denial in the Age of Obama, and Dear White America, Letter to a New Minority. I'm interested, and I want everyone to visit the website. Please go to www.timwise.org. That's .org. But I would like to know right off the top, how did a white youth, how did this come about? Like, me and Samaria were speaking, and she was saying, where did this state of consciousness come for you so early?
Well, I'm just going to appreciate that you just called me a youth.
No, I'm saying, I know that it happened in your youth. Because I know you've been doing this since college, so for it to have occurred in your youth, like...
Yeah, I'm going to bask in that for a second.
Okay.
I talk about it a lot in my memoir, White Like Me, so it's a long story. But the short version of it is, I was raised in the South to a civil rights-oriented family, and I think that for those of us who are white and grow up in the South, there's really one of two options. You either grow up deeply internalizing the racial views of the region that have been so legion, going back hundreds of years, or you grow up viscerally opposed to those. There's very little middle ground.
There really is, yeah.
There really is not. White folks who come out of the South, I think, make both the best racist and the best anti-racist, because we know that racism is woven into the very cultural DNA of our region. We're not like white folks in New England or from California or Portland or Seattle who think they don't have any racism problems. We know we do. And as a result, if you grow up white in this region and you have even remotely conscious family or friends, you stand a pretty decent chance, I think, of developing, at least at some level, an anti-racist consciousness. So I attribute some of it to that. But, I think really, and I talk about this at length in the book, even more important than that, because that was the cornerstone. But beyond that, I think, for me, going to college in New Orleans, going to Tulane University, 86 to 90, living in New Orleans for another 6 years after I graduated, brought me into contact with an awful lot of amazing mentors, mostly people of color, but also some white anti-racist allies who were involved in the struggle in that city and nationwide. And, I was very lucky to come into contact with those folks, people at the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, European Descent, DISSENT, which was the white anti-racist offshoot of the People's Institute, and getting to know those folks and really being challenged. I came into college with a certain degree of anti-racist awareness, but really nothing compared to that which I would learn in that city, going to a very white college in a very black city, both demographically and culturally. And so, I just am very fortunate to to have had both the family that I had, but also, more importantly, the people with whom I came into contact.
I find that interesting because I'm from the Midwest, and it was very much the same there. As far as you saying, it's really not a choice. You either, as you say, and I love that you say grow up, because that's what it is. But I experienced that myself.
I have a question. What is it that, to Tim, what is it that makes you see? What makes you go, I see this, I feel this, I need to speak this?
Right.
What is that about you?
Well, I think that for me, it's always been very difficult not to see it. Going back to childhood, and again, I go into probably overly explicit detail in White Like Me, but from the time that I was a kid, there were certain things that would happen that were just, I didn't always know what they were. I didn't always have the words for them.
I just knew they were wrong.
It was racism, but I knew there was something happening. I went to preschool in a preschool program that was at a historically black college, Tennessee State University, which is about 7 minutes by car from where I live right now, and I was one of 3 or 4 kids in the class who weren't black. Most of my early peers were black. Most of the authority figures in that preschool were black, and so as I grew up, when I would see my friends, frankly, who were black kids being treated differently and worse, being tracked into the lower track classes, being disciplined more harshly, even though we all broke the same school rules, it sort of stuck in the back of my mind. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew something was separating me from the friends that I had. Like I wasn't in the same study group. I wasn't in the same class. Why not? Why am I in the advanced class with these white kids who I don't even know, and who I don't actually think are very intelligent, to be perfectly honest? And my black friends, who actually thought were really bright and really insightful, are over there in the standard class or the remedial class. Why are they being sent to the office for discipline and I'm not? We were both, cutting up in class, both of us interrupting the teacher. What's going on? And I never knew for years, but I kept, it's just one of those things you file away. And in my case, I filed it away. And finally, when I graduated from college, I started working in the campaigns against David Duke, who many listeners, of course, will realize the name is, being one of the nation's most prominent white supremacist neo-Nazis, overt racist for the last 40 years. And he was running for Senate in Louisiana and later for governor in 90 and 91, and I was involved in the campaigns against him. And after those campaigns, we won, technically, those of us who were on the good side of that. But the fact is that even though Duke lost, he got 60% of the white vote.
Terrifying.
And 55% in the governor's race in 91. And I just remember sitting there in the aftermath of those elections and thinking, God, what does it say that roughly 6 out of 10 people who sign those census forms the same way that I do, basically were willing to vote for a Nazi? On the one hand, I knew that they were not themselves Nazis. Would have been easier, perhaps, if I thought they were. But I knew they weren't, and that was actually more frightening. They're not Klansmen. They're not Nazis. They're not overt white supremacists. They were willing to vote for a guy who was, and to me, that suggested that those of us who were white have a particular moral and ethical obligation to challenge ourselves and our friends and our family and our colleagues, if you will, our people. Because if we're not going to do it, who's going to do it? We got lucky in Louisiana. Black folks saved us from ourselves because they had 90% turnout, and they basically said, no, we're not going to let you crazy-ass white people vote for a Nazi. We're not going to let you do it. But if it weren't for them, we would have been completely screwed. Yeah. And so in the end, we've got to do that. We can't rely on people of color to constantly bail us out. We have to do that work.
And so you just sort of touched on another book that you've written called Barack in a Hard Place. What is the name of that title again?
Between Barack and a Hard Place, right?
Yes, and that sort of, what you've just said sort of triggered thoughts for me in the same energy as far as, so we have this African American or whatever, he's black, black president, and then we have this anger and hatred not only towards him but towards anybody who's of really anybody.
Really, it's anybody that's supporting him.
Yeah, because Ginnie, you've even said that you've come into problems if you put, when you have a bumper sticker.
Right.
I don't need a bumper sticker. It's just my skin color.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of craziness, I think, that's been under the radar for years, long before Barack Obama ever came on the political scene. I think, what his election and his presidency have done is it sort of exposed a lot of this. It didn't create it. It didn't come out of nothing. It was always there. I mean, these are the same kinds of mentalities that we saw in Louisiana in 90 and 91. I mean, that stuff, people think, 20 years ago is ancient history, but it really isn't. The reality.
But do you feel it intensified, though, after he was in office? I mean,
I think it just brought a lot of it to the surface. I think what it did was it confronted a lot of things were happening at once, and you have to keep that in mind. As I talk about in the new book, Dear White America, there are really 4 things happening at the same time that I think have intensified the reaction on the part of certain segments of the white community. The first is his election, sure, because the election of a black president, sort of challenges white folks' idea of what the leader of the country should look like, and not just a black guy, but a black guy with an exotic name, who lived in Hawaii. Is that really a state? Most white folks think of Hawaii.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, the stories that. Yeah.
I mean, so even the white folks who think he was born here still think he lived in an exotic place. It's not really white. It's not Kansas. And then in addition to that, you've got the economy melting down. So, for people of color, double-digit unemployment has been pretty regular. That's pretty normal. But for white folks, it has been since the Great Depression, let's be honest. It has been 3 generations since white people were facing this kind of economic insecurity.
Yeah.
And when you add that level of insecurity to a political culture that's changing, as evidenced by President Obama, to a popular culture, that's the third thing. Popular culture. 25 years ago, roughly, MTV didn't even play videos by black artists, right? Michael Jackson was like the only one for a while. And now we have a popular culture that's thoroughly multicultural, right? It's so interwoven that you really can't pull a single thread culturally, racially out of the popular culture without the whole thing falling apart. We are a thoroughly multicultural popular culture. And I'm not saying that's transformed the economic power structure, but it does change the sort of look and feel of America. Well, there are a lot of white folks who weren't ready for that transition. So you add that to the mix, and then finally, let's be honest, the biggest of the 4 is the demographic shift. 25 years from now, white folks are going to be half the population, people of color half the population. In a nation where white folks have been able to take for granted our normalcy, to actually have to share the designation of an American with people who you could always exclude previously is to sort of like having a private club where all of a sudden you got to let other people in. Oh my God! You mean I got to let girls into the He-Man Woman Haters Club if I'm alpha? It's like the Mardi Gras cruise in New Orleans that back in '93 got so angry because the city council said, you know what? We clean up after you. We provide police and fire protection for your floats. If you're going to, have that public subsidy, you can't discriminate. And these private crews said, well, you know what? We'll take our toys and go home. We just won't parade. We just won't have a parade at all, rather than follow equal opportunity. Because at some level, people who have always been privileged think that if you actually allow equity, you're taking something special from them.
Yes, because they've always had it.
Better. I've been special, and now you're not letting me be. And that is what is happening for white folks right now. They're having to realize that, you know what, we're only about 11% of the population on the planet. So get used to it. You've never been a majority. You just thought you were, and that's the problem.
Yeah.
I
love transcribing that.
That will be rough. I'm curious because I worked the campaign, and I remember when Obama won, and my daughters are biracial and multicultural, same as he is, and my daughter was just in tears because she worked the campaign. She was only 18. It was her first time voting. She was very, very excited. But I remember tuning to at that moment when he did it, was just this disbelief. I was like, he's been voted into office, and I said from that moment forward, nothing he did would do, obviously, it would be right. So, I mean, the scrutiny is just at such a high level, and people obviously don't want to admit or see. The blindness is just, there are no words. But he went into an administration that was in the shape that it was. that's in the shape that it is, and he was supposed to turn that around in less than 4 years. So I don't know. I would just like to hear you speak a little bit more on the fact that he's in between, a rock and a hard space. It's like, where do you go? What can you do? I can't do anything right.
But I have to add this. I also would like to hear how people are sort of dismissing the fact that just because people are hating President Obama, they are actually reacting towards the people on the street, to the black people who are actually just living and may not even vote for President Obama. They may not, but just because they're black, they're being affected because we have a black president.
Well, I don't want to stack questions, but that's something that I also wanted to bring up. Is like I watched it become more dangerous in this country for black people after he came into office.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there are two things happening here. I mean, on the one hand, there's sort of this. I mean, I remember the night that he won, thinking on the one hand, what an amazing moment. On the other hand, why in the hell would he want to be president? This is the worst time to want to be president of this country. Really, no,
it's true. It's true. I mean,
we're in the midst of a long-term structural economic crisis, and it's a structural economic crisis of late-stage capitalism, frankly, that isn't going to be solved by, moderate Democratic policies, certainly not by Republican policies. I mean, the reality is the stuff that's really necessary to pull out of the economic crisis that we're in is not something that either he or the party of which he's a part are willing to do. So he's in this awful situation, even if he were the kind of guy who wanted to do the really radical stuff. And I don't think he is, by the way. I don't think he's that guy, to be perfectly honest. I have nothing in his history to suggest that he's really all that progressive politically, contrary to those who say he's a socialist. I wish he was a socialist. He's not even close to it. The fact is, even if he were that guy, there's no way that he would be able, in our current political culture, to do any of the stuff that really would be needed to sort of break the back of this predatory capitalism that we have right now in this country and across the Western world. Secondly, I think what's really dangerous, and this is the mistake that I think white leftists often make. On the one hand, I am intensely critical of the president. I've been critical of him both for his foreign policy views, even some of his domestic policy views. In my last two books, Colorblind and Between Barack and a Hard Place, the two that came out before Dear White America, I was very critical even of his unwillingness to engage issues of racial inequity. Even though I understand the political reasons why he doesn't, I still made the argument, I think I made it reasonably persuasively, that there are things he could have done and could have done this 4 years that he hasn't. But what I do think is important for white liberals and leftists to remember is that because we live in a racialized society, there is a real fear that black and brown folk in this country have, and it is not an unreasonable fear, that if this president goes down as a failure, and I mean not in some objective way, I just mean in the eyes of the larger body politic, if his presidency is viewed as a failure, if he does not win re-election, if he is viewed as somehow an ineffective president, that is not going to only have an effect on him and the Democratic Party. That is going to have an effect on black people and people of color generally. And that is a critical point for white folks to understand. I appreciate white leftists who want to rail on him as the head of the imperial state and as the head of the empire. I get it. I agree with it. I understand that. But what white folks have got to understand is the racial politics of this country are not the same. If a white president fails, it is different than if a white president fails, it is different than if a black president fails. If this president goes down as a failure, it will resonate with white folks around the country and lead them to not only not want to have another one, quote unquote, but it will also affect the ability of average everyday black folks to get jobs doing anything in positions of authority, because the stereotype of black failure will resonate throughout the culture. That is a much bigger social cost, and that's why even those of us who are leftist and really want this man to be something that he's not, cannot afford to join in the same way in the bevy of criticism that the right does. We've got to be conscious of the racial elements here.
There's we could talk about that for hours. You put it very well, but really we could. There's so many ways and directions to take that conversation, but I want to be sure to get this in the conversation, so I'm going to bring this up at this point. I've been involved with the Trayvon Martin case since early March, and I'm just curious as to what you have to say regarding that case, and specifically for me, how do you explain, when you're doing these lectures, how do you explain to middle-class, mid-America Caucasians the history of racial profiling and the dangers of ignoring it? Because over and over again, you hear if he would have been shot by a black man, we would have never heard about, so why is it getting so much attention? I mean, how do you explain that to white people to get them to understand the significance?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's so many complicated issues here. I mean, some of them are not complicated and some of them are. I mean, on the one hand, and I've written a few things about it, which, folks can read it at my website, internalized.org, but, ultimately I think there are legal issues, which unfortunately, given the way that the criminal laws are written in the state of Florida, whether it's stand your ground or other ways that that one can interpret second-degree murder statutes, George Zimmerman may or may not be guilty under that particular interpretation of the law. What I think we as a country have got to address, and I've been trying to say this since the beginning, the jury ultimately, hopefully, will deal with this case, and whatever happens legally happens. But what I want us to think about as a culture is, what does it mean that we are so quick? And by we, I mean pretty much all of us, not just George Zimmerman. I mean white folks in general, even lots of Latinos like George Zimmerman, ostensibly, peoples of color, even lots of black folks, right, who look at other black folks, particularly young black men, and view them as threats. In the case of George Zimmerman, not only with Trayvon Martin, but with 40-some-odd other black people, including one that was 8 or 9 years old, I'm guessing maybe 4'5" on a good day, and that's even if they're an extremely well-fed, oversized 8 or 9-year-old. He called 911 on a child and said that he felt threatened by him. I mean, but if it were only George Zimmerman, we could chalk it up to his own internalized biases and leave it alone. But what we know, and we know it from the research, it's not because Tim Wise says so, it's because years of research in the field of social psychology tells us this, is that the vast majority of it, about 80% of white folks, about 75% of Latinos and Asian Americans, and even 35% of African Americans have measurable internalized racial bias against black people. So if that is true, and that may be at the very subtle and subconscious level, it may not be overt bigotry. I don't know that George Zimmerman is an overt bigot. I don't know that most people are. My guess is most people are not. But what I know is that the subconscious stuff that we have been programmed over these many, many, many years and conditioned to believe is way more impactful than the conscious. The conscious overt bigotry sometimes gets checked by our conscience. Our conscience says you're not supposed to be a bigot. So if you're sort of a bigot, gosh, I probably ought to check that. But the subconscious, that's the whole problem with it, is it's subconscious. Your subconscious cannot be checked by your conscience because you're not even aware it's happening. And so my fear is that we're going to ascribe the problem to this one guy in Sanford, Florida, and we're going to ignore the fact that, unfortunately, far too many of us, when we see a young black male in a particular kind of clothing in particular, but let's be honest, any kind of clothing, we assume that they are dangerous. That's what the evidence says. And all you've got to do is look at the response to this thing. I mean, ever since this shooting happened, there was about 48 hours of real sympathy. And then afterwards, the conversation has been constantly about how this young man was dangerous. Look at his clothes. He was a giant. He was 6'3". Actually, he was 5'11". He was 5'11", 155 pounds. And that is not threatening. That is not even remotely imposing. But here all these people are trying to say, well, of course he was afraid. There have been 6 break-ins by black people. Well, wait a minute. I thought it wasn't about race. If it's not about race, what is the relevance of the 6 previous break-ins?
And being more concerned about the fact that he had marijuana in his system at the time than outraged that Zimmerman wasn't even tested and he's the one that shot him.
Well, as I said on Twitter at the time, if having THC in your system was a justification for getting shot, I would have been Swiss cheese by the time I was 17.
Thank you.
Because I would have had far more THC. I guarantee that I smoked more weed than Trayvon Martin ever even saw, okay, by the time that I was 17 or 18. And I can say that now because the statute of limitations has expired in my But, I mean, that's the truth.
No, I'm with you on it, yeah.
The amount that was in his system was so minimal that it would have probably been at least 4 days since he had smoked, if not more.
Yeah.
And even if he was high, first of all, come on, he got Skittles and iced tea. When I was high, I got a lot, it's like Funyuns and Doritos. And a lot,
and that's
I hate to be funny about a horrible situation, but the reality is this kid was not high. And if you are high, you don't get in a fight with somebody. If you were that high, if he was stoned, it would almost be better, I think, for the case against George Zimmerman, because the reality is people that are really that high don't get in fights with other people. They just are like, hey, what's going on? Why are you following me? The truth is, look, this is what, is the difference between the legal case and the moral case. The legal case, look, maybe they did get in a fight. I don't know. If I was being followed around by some weirdo, and I'm at the age of 17, and I'm like, why are you following me? And I get a little freaked out, and you seem to, attack me, and, maybe I do fight back. Well, maybe I do, quote-unquote, stand my ground. Why do I not have the right to stand my ground, but you do? At some point, if you initiate the drama, and then as a result of me fighting back, you kill me, guess what? You're still the bad guy.
Exactly.
That's the point.
I'm worried about our generation because we're about the same age, you and I, and Samaria. We're all in the same age group, and I'm worried about our generation because it's not the overt racist. It's the guy who doesn't think that he's a racist, but is a racist. So, I really believed, I was telling Samaria not long ago that, I remember my graduation and thinking, well, I can't wait till 20 years from now because, I just knew things were going to be so much different. And they're different. I actually think they're worse. So, what about that guy and that women as well, that, aren't the overt racists, but are racist? How do you get through to them that, yes, you have racist residue?
Yeah, I'm a lot more worried. I agree with you. I'm a lot more worried about the person that says that they're colorblind and doesn't think.
Oh yeah.
Than the person who's
that phrase is such crap.
Color, I'm living this thing that seems to be a nightmare to me and an illusion or something like that. But people, just the other day, I'm at the store and I'm buying some dog food, and a lady, she grabs her purse. And she realizes she knew me from the library because I volunteer at the library and I work with the children. And she almost broke her cell phone because she was reaching so quickly to grab her purse. And then I was at also, a couple of years ago, I was at the Magic Castle in California, and you have to be a member to be in. I'm a member. And you have to wear a gown. You have to wear a dress.
Right.
And this woman grabbed her. She clutched her purse.
Right.
Because I'm just sitting there entering the place, and she felt that I was a threat to her.
Right. Just
from my existence.
Yeah.
And that sort of makes you. What would you do?
What would you do?
My guess is that if you were to ask that person at the Magic Castle in California, or perhaps even the person at the grocery anywhere, either of those cases, their larger political views, I'm guessing, particularly the person in California, that I bet they voted the right way, whatever that means, Just statistically, the odds are pretty good that they voted the right way, whatever that's supposed to mean. But the truth is, that doesn't really matter, does it? Because in that moment, they took away or in some way denigrated your humanity on the basis of a larger stereotype. So the fact that they may be liberal in the political sense, they might have voted for Obama. What does that mean? I remember the survey that came out in, I think, October. I think I talked about this between Barack and the hard place. The poll that came out in October of 2008, so a month before the election, which found that something like half or more of white Democrats said that they adhered, by their own admission, right, to at least one anti-black stereotype, and yet they still were going to vote for Obama. And so what I said in that book was, what does that say? You've got white folks who basically acknowledge, and let's be honest, a lot of people won't admit their biases. This was the 50% that were willing to admit it, right? They were willing to say, oh yeah, I think most black people are not so great. But you know what? I'm willing to vote for that one because he's okay. Which
wow.
At the end of the day is sort of like, and I make the argument in between Barack and the hard place that, it's sort of like, the Cliff Huxtableization of Barack Obama, right? It's like turning him into the Cliff Huxtable of politics, which is, oh yeah, that black guy, we like him. We just don't like most of them. And to be honest with you, not only is that not racism, it most certainly is racism, but in fact, it's a more difficult and pernicious racism than the racism that takes place.
Because there's so much denial.
There's a reason that black folks are moving back to the South from California, and there are only two possible explanations for that. One is black people are crazy and are going back to the source, the site of the crime, the scene of the crime, and are just insane to leave these wonderful places like Los Angeles and San Francisco and Oakland, right? Or maybe they know something that white folks don't, which is it's easier to deal with the devil you know than the devil you don't know. And just, for your white listeners, I'm not actually calling white people devils, so let's be clear. I'm not actually saying that, right? I'm just saying in some ways the overt racism is easier to process than the subtle invisibility that peoples of color in places like the Bay Area, in Seattle, in Portland. And I've had black folks in the Bay Area tell me it's the most racist place they ever lived. And when I say that to white folks, they look at me like I'm speaking a language only spoken on Neptune. Like how can that?
So what is his first step then? What's the first step? What's the first step with the overt? I'm sorry, not the overt racist. The racist that is in denial that they're racist. I mean, what is the first step in helping them realize that they are racist? I'm talking about
really, it shouldn't be complicated. I mean, look, here's the thing. Think about consumerism, right, as another ism, right? So most of us, when we go to the store, like when I go grocery shopping, I don't know about you, but like most people, I would guess, I go to the store and, man, I am totally a sucker for like impulse buying. I mean, and these advertisers and these marketers that market their products, they know what they're doing. They spend billions of dollars to know that they know what they're doing. So when you go to the grocery and you get up there to the counter and there's like chocolate, and there's like ridiculous tabloid magazines, and the only reason they
wait, chocolate is good.
I'm not saying.
Let's get that disclaimer in there. No.
But what I'm saying is, like, there's a reason it's there.
Of course,
for example, you go to the grocery, notice they don't put chocolate in the back right-hand corner of the store, right? They put it up front, and there's a reason, because they know that there's a conditioning, there's a certain effect of advertising, and the effect in this case is they know that it works. So advertising works. And so what I say to people is, it isn't about feeling guilty or bad or beating yourself up that you fell into consumerism. The fact is that people put their chocolate and or tabloid magazines and or mints and or beef jerky, which nobody really likes but people apparently buy, up front so that you will buy them. And so to that extent, if we all sort of fall into that, now the reality is, though, I say we all fall into it, if we go to the store, like if I go to the store, I went to the store today, and I told myself I'm not going to give in to that. Right? I said I'm going to be really conscious. I'm just going to buy what I need. I'm not going to get crazy, right? And so I did better. I didn't buy a lot of unnecessary stuff because I consciously decided to challenge myself and to challenge my conditioning. The problem is when it comes to things like racial conditioning, gender conditioning, religious conditioning, sexual conditioning, we don't normally wake up and go, all right, today I'm going to challenge homophobia, or today I'm going to challenge heterosexism or racism or sexism or patriarchy, right? We don't think about it. But if we do, the good news, and I talk about this in my book Colorblind, the good news is the research says we can, in fact, interrupt the process of discriminatory behavior by being more conscious of our sort of intellectual, emotional conditioning.
Oh, absolutely.
So it's just a matter of saying, look, advertising works, whether it's a company trying to sell you tennis shoes, toilet paper, or smartphones, or whether it's an entire culture trying to sell you racial stereotypes. It works. It doesn't make you a bad person. I think the reason that most white folks don't want to admit that is because they think that if they admit that there's, part of them that's racist, it's like saying, oh, I'm a bad person. No, it means that you're human.
So you're saying that you think, I'm a therapist, you're saying that you believe that a lot of it is just reprogramming, rewiring of the automatic thoughts that come, that we've been conditioned?
Just trying to be aware of the subconscious, and I know in some ways that's a contradiction, because to the extent something is subconscious, you're not aware of it. That's the point. But I think that we can drag the subconscious into the conscious light by just simply knowing the research. Like when I actually started to read the research on subconscious conditioning around race, for instance, and around implicit bias, it's been a major vein of research on race for like 10 or 15 years. It was incredibly liberating to me because it allowed me to let go of the guilt, right, associated with having racially prejudicial thoughts and just deal with the reality of what it meant. And actually, it allowed me to get angry. Like when I started to understand what was happening to me. So, for instance, in White Like Me, my memoir, I talk about a story from 2003 where I was getting on an airplane and I happened to have two black pilots. And I had this just instantaneous, very quick, very brief, but nonetheless one that I remembered thought in my head about, oh my God, can they fly this plane? And then I caught myself in the middle of that thought, and I was like, what the hell was that? I realized how ridiculous that was and how racist that was. But the fact that that thought came into my mind caused me all kinds of emotional angst for weeks and months. And then when I began to read some of the material that explained why that was happening, I was able to do two things. Number one, I was able to contextualize it, right, and to understand that that wasn't just me for whom that was happening. That was happening to lots of people, and I actually talked about it with people of color who had the same reaction when they had pilots of color or bankers of color or other authority members of color who they also just instantaneously questioned their competence because they've been conditioned. And secondly, it allowed me to let go of the guilt and the self-flagellation and instead replace that with anger. How dare this culture turn me into that? Because that's not who I was as a child. And when that happened, I had a 2-year-old, and I had a child that was I had one that was not quite 2, and one that was, 10 months in the womb, not even born yet. And I remember thinking, how dare this culture put that on my children, that the fact that we're all being conditioned that way is a real curse that we've got to deal with. And so it actually spurred my activism. So I think that if we get a hold of all the things that are conditioning us, we have a real possibility of making a change both personally and institutionally.
I think it's very important what you're saying about allowing white people to admit that there's a bias there, because I have to, real quick, I want to bring up when the Trayvon Martin battle to get George Zimmerman arrested was at its deepest. They did a special on CNN, Caller with Children, Racism and Children. And this is information we already had. That wasn't surprising at all. But what concerned me about it was when they had some of the parents, so these are the parents that volunteered to be interviewed about what their children had stated or said. The parents were just covering up. They just were explaining away why their children made the statements that they made, the racist comments that they made. They weren't actually taking.
What were the statements?
Well, there were just one of them, for example, was a young man. He appeared to be about 13 or 14. That his parents would be upset if he dated a girl that was black, and and then the parents were explaining it away why he may think that yada yada yada. But what was more concerning to me is that we're still not, because the wound's there. Okay, you don't need to be very intelligent or have very many brain cells to realize the wound is there. But for us to clean it out is now the question. And to clean it out, we have to change those thought processes. And white people have to be able to say, yeah, I do think this. Why do I think it? Have the confidence to say it, care enough about it to say it. And but for us to still be in the place where we're still trying to cover everything up instead of open it up and look at it. I mean, if I'm a white mother and I'm in middle America, I'm asking her, why are you not concerned that a 17-year-old kid was shot and killed in a nice neighborhood? I know the area well. I work there. Why are you not outraged about that?
Right.
How can you just file it away under, I just don't get it. I don't get it.
Well, and I think it's you're right. It doesn't make sense on one level, on the human level that we all ought to sort of operate on. On a different level, it sadly makes too much sense. And what I mean by that is, we live in a culture that has told every one of us from the beginning of time, in this society in particular, that wherever we end up in life, economically, culturally, criminally, whether in jail or out of jail, somehow is a reflection of our character, right? We live in this notion, this society that tells us that our society is a meritocracy. So wherever you end up, it's all about your own stuff. It's about your hard work. It's about your ethics. It's maybe even about your genetics. But it's certainly about your behavior. And so unfortunately, if you're raised in a society like that, it becomes very easy for you to conclude that the people who are at the bottom, whether that's economically or whether that's people who are imprisoned, are somehow fundamentally characterologically different than you. And in fact, there's a real emotional and psychological boost, that a subsidy, if you will, that actually comes from believing that. There's a book that I read many years ago that I really highly recommend to anyone listening, called The Culture of Inequality by Michael Lewis. And it's a brilliant book that actually was written in like 1978, and everything he says, in 1978 resonates all these many years later. He says that one of the things that's most dangerous is that because we have this individual as central sensibility, this idea that the individual is the key to their own life outcomes, any time that people are, convicted of a crime or just are poor or are, receiving some form of public assistance, that it's clearly a mark against their character, because if they were decent, if they were hardworking, if they were law-abiding, that wouldn't have happened to them. And this is maybe the first society in the history of the world where that has been a logical, operative belief for so many millions of people. Because let's be honest, in those European feudal societies from which most white folks come, that would have been ridiculous. We all understood it in Europe that, your outcomes were based on your family. Like, everybody understood that. If you weren't related to the queen or the king, you weren't going to ever be the queen or the king, period. That was it. But in this country, white folks in particular have had the luxury of believing that if we just worked hard enough, we could be anything. Now, black and brown folk always knew that wasn't true, right? People of color always knew it was way more complicated than that. But white folks have had the luxury of buying into that notion. And I think as a result, when something like Katrina happens, when something like Trayvon Martin happens, when, pick your story. Any time that a person of color is on the receiving end, or people of color are on the receiving end of some horrific systemic injustice, it becomes easy for people in the dominant group to completely eliminate any systemic analysis at all in favor of an individual analysis that says, well, if they had just gotten out of town, if they just weren't dependent on government, they would have left. If he just wasn't wearing a hoodie, he would have left. It's one after another excuse, because those are the things that allow white people to maintain a faith in a system that people of color always known was wrong.
Can I ask something that you may not have tapped into this, but I have a question. So, say for instance, you have a family, I'll just say from like the South, and you move to the South, or you do something that they feel like you deserve because, it's like those elements that you just mentioned. It's weird to me experiencing that mentality when it seems as though we should at this point be able to live where we want to live or be where we want to be, but you've got your family who will go, well, you shouldn't have done this, and it stems from even my parents from their experiences. And so it's sort of weird. I mean, you may not, because you're not black, you may not get what I'm speaking of, but it's like, if you do this, then you deserve it.
Yeah.
And so
So because you moved back to the South, you deserve the treatment that you receive living in the South. Is that?
Or even if you don't move back to the South, it's like, so I decide to do this particular thing. Could be I say, okay, so I'm gonna take a challenge and become an actress. You know that there's these challenges, there's this racism and boom, 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 and so you deserve what you get. There's never there's never any kind of situation where they go, oh, that's not cool. They go, well, that was your choice.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there are two things operating here, right? When folks of color manifest that attitude of indifference or whatever towards other people of color, there's a lot of internalized oppression operating. I mean, look, part of the system of oppression, one of the things that is required for it to actually work is, in order to colonize people's bodies and their land, you have to colonize their mind. I mean, that's a prerequisite, because if people's minds are not colonized, at least some people, it's very hard to control them. And so if white supremacy is going to function as a system, there's a certain degree to which at least some people of color have to be brought into that thinking, and that thinking may manifest as, black conservatism, or it may manifest as black folks saying, well, what do you expect? You got into that white person's game, whatever that game was. Maybe it's entertainment industry, maybe it's banking, maybe it's higher education. I mean, any institution you want to name is dominated in America. Well, what did you expect? And so there's a certain degree to which, unfortunately, that mentality of expectation and under entitlement comes from a system of oppression. And then the white version of that, of course, is white folks will also say that to people of color. Well, what did you expect? You knew that this was a white-dominated institution, so, you've got to get used to the fact that we tell racist jokes at lunchtime.
Oh, my God.
Or the same thing is said to women,
I've been told that. Actually,
yeah, of course. And the same thing happens to women as women, right? The idea that, well, of course, we tell sexist jokes in the break room, but you got to get used to that. It's a male-dominated profession. Women who were in male-dominated jobs are told that all the time. And all of that really, what's sad about that to me is not just that it's horribly oppressive toward those people who were targeted, it's also incredibly limiting even to the dominant group. Like, for instance, to be told that, well, what do you expect? It's a white-dominated institution, is to basically say to those of us who are white, well, we can't expect any better of you. You're so weak, you're so incapable of anything better that of course you're racist. You can't possibly rise above that. Or to say to men, well, yeah, you tell sexist jokes and you make all these horribly sexist comments, but you're men. What do we expect of you? Like, as a man, there's something offensive about that. As a man married to a woman I love very much with 2 daughters, whom I love very much, to say that I'm not capable of better than that is to not just denigrate them, it's to denigrate me. It's to denigrate men as men and to say that, well, we're sort of victims of biology and we can't do any better. It's an incredibly dehumanizing thing to say even to the majority dominant group in that regard.
Well, I know our time is running short, and we want to return you to that wonderful family you're just telling us about. But I would like to ask you one last question, and that's to the white person that's listening, and I want them to understand, why is addressing racism important to them? I want them to understand. Can you just speak on that?
Ways I could answer it, and in the latest book, Dear White America, I spend 50, 60 pages of the 160 talking about that. I'll just make it as simple as I can. The reality is that when we ignore racial inequality, and when we ignore racism and discrimination against one group of people, the fact is, ultimately, the dangers and the damage of that, it's going to come full circle. Right now, we are experiencing, as a country, a global economic meltdown that is affecting millions of people of color and white folks. But here's the reality. This economic meltdown was triggered in large part by a housing crisis that was brought on by criminal and unethical lenders, some of them banks, some of them independent mortgage companies, that began in the early to mid-1990s selling subprime predatory loans to people of color. And at the time, nobody, certainly most people in the white community, didn't think twice about it. The media didn't talk about it. Politicians didn't talk about it. So nothing got done. There were no regulations. There were no policies passed. And because it didn't affect us, and here we are, roughly 20 years later, 15 years later, 17 years later, and all of a sudden, those lenders that started off jacking around people of color ended up 10 years later figuring, hey, there's money to be made in white communities, so let's go out there, let's go to the suburbs, let's go to the small towns, let's rip them off the same way. Ultimately, when you ignore injustice against one group, wait around long enough, and I promise you it is going to come to your group. Yeah. And so that's what we're seeing right now. If we had taken it seriously, we could have potentially prevented some of this crisis. And the bottom line is, in 25 years, this is it, bottom line, putting aside the ethical and moral is law. I'd love to make the moral case. I could make it if we had 3 hours. But here's the practical. Bottom line, I don't care what white folks think about any of this. The reality is, in 25 to 30 years, half the population is going to be people of color, half are going to be white. I don't care if you like it. I don't care if your mom and dad like it, your friends like it, your colleagues and coworkers, your neighbors like it. That's the truth. How are we going to remain a fundamentally functional society, I mean economically, if we get to that day and people of color are still twice as likely to be out of work, 3 times as likely to be in poverty, 1/10 to 1/20th the net worth, 9 years less life expectancy, double the rate of infant mortality. The reality is that is not a recipe for a functional society.
No, it is not.
It's a recipe for total destruction. Bottom line, we have a choice. It is either solidarity with people of color or it is absolute destruction of our culture and our society as we know it. That's it.
Wow. Yeah. That takes some processing, but it's absolutely true. Very good answer. I'm going to ask just 2 more minutes of you. I ask all of my guests at the end of the conversation, if you were to have the attention of the world for 2 minutes, what would you say? And this is on, just in general. What would you say to the world if you had their attention for just 2 minutes?
I guess what I would say is we have an incredibly limited amount of time. I mean, any of us individually on this planet. Some of us have more than others. Some of us have way too much time, frankly, and some of us have way too little. And it seems to me that in the short little amount of time that we have as human beings, wasting resources, taking resources from other species that maybe could make better use of them, that we need to figure out what it is we're about, and we need to figure out what it is we stand for, and we need to figure out how we are going to justify our time on this earth, wasting the oxygen that we have wasted, using the resources that we have used. I don't claim to know what the meaning of life is, but I do know that if life has any meaning at all, part of that meaning must be the struggle to create greater justice and humanity and equity for people and non-human species on this planet. If that's not the point of life, what is it? You know? And so it seems to me we should spend some real time trying to figure out what it is that allowed us to be here at this time, in this moment, particularly if we're members of the most powerful nation in the history of humankind. What do you think deserves, how do you think you deserve to be here in this place, in this time, as opposed to being born any number of billions of other people you could have been born on this planet? It seems to me that figuring out how to create justice and equity is the kind of stuff that humanity is made out of. That's how we become fully human, as James Baldwin said. And a lot of times I think we make the mistake of thinking that just because we're members of a species known as Homo sapiens that we are human. That is a category mistake. Homo sapiens is a biological category. Human is a philosophical, a metaphysical, an epistemological, a moral category. We have to earn that title, and we have not, as a species, done that yet.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tim. I want everyone to visit your website at, once again, it's timwise, WISE.org. I want to thank you, Samaria and I both, for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And I
have so many more questions. We have to have a part 2 and 3. Jamal Joseph?
Totally do that. I'll put you off for too long. We're going to do part 2, part 3, part 4.
Okay, I love you.
Well, Samaria, I want to thank you as well for being my co-host for this conversation. And to all of you who have joined us for this part 1, we want to thank you for taking the time to learn more about one another, take care of one another, and remember the only love we have is the love we make, the love we create. Until next time, this is Ginnie Love, Samaria, and Tim Wise, and I wish you love, light, and peace.
You're listening to Lyrical Rhapsody.
You're listening to Lyrical Rhapsody on Emancipation Radio. Emancipate your mind.
www.emancipationradio.com